right, thank you for coming out today. This is our final event of the Central Wisconsin Book Festival authors that we're hosting here at the McMillan Library. And before we get started, I would like to read and thank some of our festival supporters. So support for the 2024 Central Wisconsin Book Festival was provided by the Marathon County Public Library, the Portage County Public Library, and the McMillan Memorial Library. The Community Arts Grant Program of the Community Foundation of the North Central Wisconsin, with funds provided by the Wisconsin Arts Board, a state agency, the Community Foundation, and the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation. Support also provided by the Merco Foundation, Reuter Ware Law Firm, Center for the Visual Arts, the Portage County Public Library Foundation, the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point Libraries, Yankee Bookstore, Bound to Happen Books, Sojourn Booksellers, and Peking Restaurant. And today we have Lindsay Starck. Lindsay is a Pushcart Prize-winning author, editor, and professor. Her novels, including Noah's Wife and Monsters We Have Made, explore the boundaries of family, love, and reality. So please give a warm welcome to Lindsay Starck.
Hi, thank you all. Ooh, I'm just gonna adjust this a little bit. Can I hold it? Is this okay? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you for coming out. I was saying to Colin, it's such a beautiful, perfect fall day. It's hard to be inside. My first novel, Noah's Wife, was all about a town where it rains every day for as long as people can remember. I feel like I should have tried to get some of that rain, vibe in the air to drive people inside. But I'm so glad to be here talking about monsters, and really happy to be in a library. My mom, when I was growing up, she worked in the Milwaukee Public Library. I'm from Milwaukee. I live in Minneapolis right now. And so I grew up around books. She worked in events and marketing, especially for kids and children's literature. And conversations at the dinner table were always kind of interesting. My dad was a lawyer and working with kind of multi-million-dollar contract stuff. And he'd come home and be like, I had such a hard day. I had all these contracts. It was so stressful. And my mom would say, oh man, I know what you're talking about. I just could not figure out where to park Mrs. Frizzle's bus. And so, yeah, we always had ways, or she was so good at kind of finding ways to bring literature to life. And so I really, value the library, and especially libraries in Wisconsin. So thank you for having me. I'm here to talk today about my new novel, Monsters We Have Made. You can see the cover here. I love this cover. It's actually the third that the publisher sent to me. People sometimes ask, how much choice do you have over your cover image? And the answer is not a lot, but some veto power if you're really nice. And so the first two I didn't love, but this one I think is great. If you haven't read the book, it's parts of it take place in the North Woods. There's this monster called the Kingman who lives kind of along the shores of Lake Superior. And so those trees kind of represent him and the crown, all of that. So it's really evocative, and I really love it. But yeah, so I just want to talk today a little bit about my writing and about the book, and answer questions if there are any from readers, writers out there. So I'm a fiction writer, but also by day a professor of creative writing. So I think a lot about how fiction works, and I talk with my students a lot about what makes a story run. And two of the building blocks of fiction we talk about most are fear and desire. These are kind of the two wheels that fiction, they make fiction turn. And I want to talk about both and kind of how both play into the novel. And I want to start by talking first about fear, since the title of the book has monsters in it. And since it does have some elements of mystery and thriller and a little bit of horror, but mostly kind of the psychological kind. And fear, I think, can be an engine in fiction because it moves us to action for every genre, right? Even if you think about something like a romance, someone is moved to action, moved to find love out of the fear of being alone, right? So kind of what drives us, what motivates us. And yeah, so I was thinking a lot about fear and kind of putting characters in situations in which they are afraid. So Sylvia, my main character, my protagonist, has a central fear, and it shapes the whole story. And that fear is losing the child that she's wanted for so long. And she's very fearful that someone will come and take her child from her, and that comes from experiences that she had when she was growing up. So, one of the things I learned when writing my first novel, I was working with an editor who was really good with kind of first-time novelists and patient and taking the time to walk me through various elements of plot. And one of the things she taught me is that in fiction, right, for a character, you always want to you have to think so much about motivation. There always has to be a reason. In Noah's Wife, I had a character who, in one version of the novel, not the version that made it out, but one of the many versions, my protagonist was really depressed. And my editor said to me, "Well, why is she depressed?" And I said, "Well, that's the thing about depression. If you could pinpoint a cause, you could immediately fix it, right? Often the clouds just descend without warning. You don't know why." And Amy, my editor, said, "Well, that's fine in life, but in fiction, you always need a reason." And so Sylvia's reason, her fear, kind of what sets her into motion, we find on the very beginning of the novel, the very sort of first section that I just want to share with you today. So this is Sylvia, my protagonist, a mother whose daughter has committed a terrible crime. We'll talk about the inspiration for that in a minute. And this is sort of 10 years later, and she's reflecting back on what happened and what's going to happen next. So here's her backstory. "I grew up in a house of disappearing children. I want you to know this. I need you to see how the infants spun through my world like carousel horses, fretful and untamed. For 13 days, they would squall in their cradles and coo in my mother's arms, and on the 14th day, the caseworker would click through the front door on her scuffed black pumps, sling the baby across the padded shoulder of her blazer, and crunch back down the crushed shell driveway to her car. My mother and I would watch from behind the screened windows of the porch, the sea breeze ribboning through our limp hair, our elbows hoisted in a paltry imitation of a wave. The gulls pinwheeled overhead, and I imagined that I heard in their high-pitched, anguished cries an echo of the emotions that I did not yet have the words to express. The next month, a new infant would be swaddled and delivered to our door, and the carousel would careen around again. I've tried to remember how the situation was first explained to me. Was it my sister who described the sterile hallways of a distant hospital, the nurses scuttling around a woman who was writhing on a white bed, straining to bring a baby into that fluorescent-lit room? Well, I didn't know what it meant to be in labor. Somehow I came to understand that the infants who flitted through our lives possessed not one mother, but two. In addition to the woman on the white bed, there was another shadow figure, lingering somewhere nearby, waiting to spirit that child away. It would be a long time before I learned about adoption laws, the transferal of parental rights, and the revocation of consent. Back then, between the ages of 6 and 9, all I knew was that I adored those strangers' babies. I spent hundreds of hours combing their bald heads and humming fragments of invented lullabies, and when I ran out of those, rattling off the names of all the seashells I could recall. Coquinas, augurs, olives, whelks. I celebrated whenever a new infant arrived, and I sobbed each time one of them left us, and I swore that when I was finally old enough to have a baby of my own, I'd never, ever let her go. Do you see what I mean? To figure out where I went wrong, I must tunnel back to the source. When I turned 18, I left the Carolina coast and drove 3 hours inland through woods so lush that the emerald arms of branches wrapped around the highway. My second year in college at a state university that towered over a town of bungalows and barbecues, I declared myself an English major. I made friends out of novels, and I wrote long-winded essays in a corner booth of the cafe near my dorm. I analyzed centuries-old poems with the furious patience of a detective assigned to a cold case, scanning line after line while patrons nearby clinked their pint glasses together or dipped their sweet potato fries into bowls of lightly garliced mayo. It was during my final year in a course on the history of the English language that I became hooked on etymologies. How thrilling to trace a word back to its source, to shovel down through generations until you strike a root. You cannot understand a thing until you've memorized its nuances and transformations, until you've tracked it back to the beginning. The word origin is from the Latin originem, a commencement, a rise, a lineage, a birth. The stem oriri, to appear above the horizon, to become visible. In other words, if you can uncover an origin, the world brightens. You see more clearly. Something that was once invisible is revealed to you. You see now why it is so important to understand about the babies. I want you to ache with my yearning for them. I want you to feel in your open palms, your empty arms, my hunger for a child of my own, and my fear even then that if I loved her too much, she would be taken from me. Years later, when I was pregnant with Faye, I would hear in my dreams the clip of the caseworker's heels and the slam of her car door and the roar of that ancient engine, the sound ebbing as the distance expanded between us and another infant was carried away. I'd hug my swollen belly and sidle closer to Jack, who could sense my distress even in his sleep. He'd roll onto his side and fling an arm across my bare shoulders and tug me toward his rib cage. There, he'd murmur drowsily, his breath warm and unexpectedly sweet. Everything will be all right. So we have a sense there, I wanted to open there because I wanted us to know, as Sylvia says, sort of where she's coming from, where that fear is coming from. And in the novel, her greatest fear will come true. When Faye, her daughter, is 9 years old, she'll become obsessed with an internet monster called the Kingman, and she'll commit a crime in his name, and Sylvia's whole family and marriage and world will fall apart. She'll spend the rest of the novel trying to put those pieces back together. So the Kingman and the story, if you know anything about Slender Man, if you're in Wisconsin, Slender Man was one of the inspirations for this novel. So, I read about this crime when it happened almost exactly 10 years ago in 2014 in May, in a suburb of Milwaukee, when two girls, true story, read about this internet monster, decided he was real and that they had to kill a classmate in order to prove themselves to him. And after committing this crime, they started walking up the highway to the North Woods. And I remember hearing of this crime, and it just really stayed with me. And I just found myself wondering, what would I do if I were a parent of one of these girls? What, sort of responsibilities do we bear for the people we love? I also was interested in this idea of a fiction, a monster that's not real, coming out of the internet and becoming real. What does it mean if a monster isn't real, but the crime you commit is real? Have you made him real? So all of these questions were tangled up in the seeds of the novel. And so I researched other monsters and read a lot about them, watched a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer for research, and read a lot about how monsters are they're often through culture and history, they represent specific fears and desires of our moment. So when we're afraid of something, we put it in monster form. And so I was thinking about the monster that I would create and sort of what he represents and what makes the Kingman a monster for right now. And it was really fun creating a monster. So I just wanted to read to you a little bit about him, the Kingman, just so you get a sense of who he is. And yeah. All right, so okay, I'll start here. So this is Sylvia's reflecting on the trial. So after her daughter commits this crime, there's a trial. She goes to a juvenile detention center. And this is Sylvia sort of learning about the monster for the first time that had captured Faye's imagination, but which Faye had kept secret from her. No one believes me when I say that I knew nothing of the monster till the day of the crime. But I wasn't on the message boards. I hadn't seen the photographs or watched the homemade videos with those shaky handheld cameras. I had no idea that in the year before the crime, the Kingman's online popularity had soared to staggering heights. During the hearing, I saw some of the papers that Pine and her colleagues had retrieved from Faye's bedroom. Someone rolled a projection screen into the courtroom on squeaky wheels, and the lawyers clicked through PowerPoint slides with photographs of colored pencil drawings. I could remember the fresh box of colored pencils open on the edge of Faye's desk. I'd purchased them for her at the beginning of the school year because she'd worn her old ones down. When I'd asked to see some of her drawings, she'd shown me sketches of the cat or the house or the pond. I'd never seen the ones projected over the judge's head in the courtroom. Lush forests filled with hundreds of jade leaves, heavy lines of yellow sunlight slashing through clearings, textured branches dripping with multicolored birds. My breath hooked in my throat. The images were painstaking, vibrant, beautiful. Faye had breathed life into those woods. It wasn't until the prosecutor pointed out the figure that I saw him, a midnight-colored smudge in the distance. I could make out limbs, though it was hard to tell which belonged to the figure and which belonged to the tree. An amber crown spiked above his head, but the space where his face should have been was expressionless, featureless, blank as the paper beneath him. Although that was my first glimpse of the Kingman, a cold recognition shook me. Was it just my memory playing tricks on me, or had I once seen the same nebulous silhouette, the same sharp glimmer of gold, just across the borders of my vision? That night, after arguments had ended for the day, I went home to hunt down the Kingman. I crawled deep into the thicket of the internet, digging through forums and chat rooms and blogs for stories, photographs, explanations. I learned that the Kingman was a creature of the forest, that he could be found among any stand of trees, no matter how young or how thin, but he preferred the primeval perfume of black spruce and balsam fir. He wore a light-colored crown and a black cloak that was sometimes, in colder climates, rimmed with the fur of a snowshoe hare. His riches were rumored to be immeasurable, his castle undiscoverable. Although he had appeared to humans of all ages, it was children who tended to vanish with him. No one knew where those children were taken. Some described a castle built of stones and secret wishes. Others referred to the Winter Island, or more simply, the woods. The more that I read, the more I began to visualize this place, this fairy realm, with yellow moss as soft as silk rugs and trees as old as the soil they grew in, and cold, pewter-colored waves spraying a gossamer mist over the rocks. So that's just a little bit of Sylvia on the monster. And one of the fun things that I did was, I thought it was fun. I hope readers think it's fun as well. But because I was creating this mythology, creating this legend, creating this monster, I wanted readers to experience the same kind of shifty, what's real, what's not feeling. And so I went to the historical record and I found instances of like famous unsolved mysteries in history. So the children, the story of the Pied Piper, who sort of takes children away in the German town of Hamelin in the Middle Ages. We picture in fairy tales the piper playing his pipe and the children leaving, but actually there is a record in that town of how there's a stone memorial that says something like, it's been 100 years since our children were lost. Like there was a loss of children. We don't know exactly what happened. Another one of the unsolved mysteries was the Roanoke colony in early America. When settlers founded this colony, a bunch of people left to get more supplies, and when they came back, all of the colonists were gone. So I took these little tidbits and then I just kind of changed them a little bit to put the Kingman in them. I mean, we don't know what happened, so I guess, it could be the Kingman, could be a monster, could be something else. But maybe I will read one of those now so you can get a sense of them. They're just these really kind of short italicized spots between the chapters. So here's the one about the Pied Piper, which we do know is kind of a fairy tale, but does have grounding in the historical record. Most people know the story of the Pied Piper. He arrived in the German town of Hamelin to find it infested with rats. The townspeople offered him a mighty sum for taking care of the rodent problem. So he played his pipe and led the rats away to the river, where they all drowned. When the townspeople refused to pay him, he played his pipe and led the children away to a mountain, which swallowed them up forever. What most people don't know is that this supposed fairy tale is grounded in historical fact. 130 children in Hamelin really did disappear in 1284. In 1384, the town erected a stained glass window in the main church that told the story of their tragedy. The line in the town register that describes the placement and unveiling of the window states simply, "It is 100 years since our children left." The window has since been lost or destroyed, but contemporary accounts of it describe the image of an individual standing just outside the town gate, dressed not in pied or multicolored robes, but in a shimmering black cloak and a gold stone crown. His face was made of a single piece of clear square glass, so that when you looked at him, you could see through the wall to the woods that used to stand not far from the church. There was no pipe portrayed in the window. So what happened to the children? A plague? A landslide? A mass drowning? The Children's Crusade? Today, speculations abound. But what scholars really want to find is that window, which may be the earliest known representation of the Kingman on the European continent. So that's an example of one of them, and I'll read just one more. Again, it's short. Another kind of mysterious disappearance in history is the aviator Charles Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped, and yeah, you'll hear the story here again from the historical record. So I just took the mystery and kind of tried to wiggle my monster into the story a little bit. In 1932, the Lindbergh baby disappeared. Although authorities claimed to have found a body, and although they pinned the crime on German immigrant Bruno Hauptmann, the case has never felt closed. Hauptmann went to the electric chair, protesting his conviction and insisting upon his innocence. The evidence, experts agreed, was only circumstantial. Sources close to the family suggested at the time that the infant's body was a fake. Could this be why Charles Lindbergh himself insisted on cremation? His friends told reporters, at cafes and public parks, always off the record, that the family continued searching for their baby for years, long after Hauptmann's execution. Lindbergh and his wife both dreamed separately of their child standing in a clearing, holding the hand of a figure whose face they could not discern. In the heavy gray light before dawn, Lindbergh would climb into his plane and fly low over his property. His engine would roar as he looped around and around New Jersey in ever-widening circles. He was pursuing shadows, said his friends. He saw the flicker of lights in forests and fields where he knew there were no houses. "Hey," he would cry, his voice whipping back into the sky. "Where have you taken my son?" So that's, a little bit about monsters and fears. And I just want to also talk about the other piece I mentioned. So fear is kind of one driver of fiction, what you're afraid to lose, and how that motivates you to act. And then the other one, of course, is desire. Fiction 101, we're always talking about what does your character want? What will she do to get it? Will she get it? And so there's a lot of desire in this story as well. Even though it has monsters on it, and it's got this sort of dark North Woodsian internet crime element to it, my editor, Caitlin, always maintained that it's first and foremost a love story. And I think that's true as well. And sort of the questions that run through the book, who do we love? Why do we love them? And what happens when the limits of that love are tested? So that's a big part of the book as well. So there are different kinds of love. And one of them is the love between young girls and young friends. Faye, Sylvia's daughter, commits this crime with a friend of hers, and there's something about their age and kind of their imaginary play that have them sort of create together this monster that they wouldn't have done if it was just one of them. But something about the talking about the monster together is what makes it real. Psychologists and researchers call this folie à deux, the madness of two, this idea that a delusion is kind of easier to spread if it's shared between two or multiple minds. And these girls, they really also love each other, and that's a big part of the book as well. So I'll just read a little bit about their friendship, a quick glimpse of them. The story is told from multiple perspectives. And here we have the friend, Elizabeth, remembering what it was like to be friends with Faye when the two of them were young. So these are the two girls, they're friends. They're going to commit this crime. In this kind of memory, they haven't done it yet. But again, it's sort of imagining sort of the power of friendship, of being young, and where is that line between play and reality? Yeah, there's actually this great Grimm Brothers story about this. I won't talk about it right now. It's very dark, but maybe during a question period. So this is Elizabeth, the friend, kind of remembering her friendship with Faye and before they commit this crime. Once the two of them became friends, the other girls stopped kicking pebbles at Elizabeth during recess. They stopped blocking her cubby in the classroom, stopped stealing her water bottle, stopped hiding her backpack from her. It wasn't that they liked Faye. It was that she unnerved them. She had this way of peering past them that made them look compulsively back over their shoulders. If they laughed at her, she didn't seem to hear it. If someone said her name, she often responded 10 seconds too late. Elizabeth didn't know where Faye went when she was gazing out the classroom window, but wherever it was, Elizabeth wanted to go there with her. With Faye, everything changed. Other people, boring people, woke up and ate cereal, went to school and to work, came home and watched television and went to bed and did it all again. Other lives, Faye explained, were routine, predictable. But that's only because most people didn't know where to search, as she did, for mystery. Sometimes, Elizabeth wished she could tell someone about the elaborate parties Faye organized in her bedroom for the characters in the stories that they read, for the creatures in the drawings that they made. She wished she could describe the way Faye held an invisible brownie between her thumb and index finger, the way she laughed at the jokes that she imagined being told. Elizabeth used to sit as close to her as possible, raising her cup when Faye raised hers. Sometimes they'd sing with guests whose voices they couldn't hear, or dance with people whose feet they couldn't see. Nobody at those parties cared that Elizabeth's clothes were the wrong size, or that her sneakers had holes, or that her parents were gone. Not even her. But it was impossible to explain the magic of those hours, or how safe she felt with Faye in a world of their creation. Nothing bad could happen to them here. They simply wouldn't let it. So that's a little kind of glimpse of this love between friends. And another element of love, we certainly have the love between Sylvia and Jack, her husband, but there's also familial love. And at one point I struggled with this in the writing process because my character Sylvia, she is going on this journey over the course of the novel to find out what happened to her daughter who's missing, to sort of track the king man through the woods. And I knew she needed a companion, that the story would be more interesting if she had someone to kind of bounce ideas off of. And so I struggled in multiple drafts to figure out who this person who would accompany her would be. And so I tried a childhood best friend for her. I tried a roommate that she'd been really close to in young adulthood, and none of them really worked. And I maybe should have started this story by telling you I'm an only child. So sometimes siblings just don't really occur to me as a thing that exists in the world. And so I was really struggling. And I said to my husband, okay, so I'm looking for a kind of relationship. And I want Sylvia to have a person who she's close to and knows really well, but there's tension, and there's conflict. It's really sort of complicated. What do you call something like that? And Chris was like, a sister, a brother, something like that. So that's how Sylvia came to have Rosie, her sister, who I love the idea of siblings. They just they don't occur to me always. So she has this sister, and her sister is a truth teller and is giving Sylvia some tough love in this passage as they're working together to find out what happened to Sylvia's daughter. It was Layla who guided me upstairs. By then I was blinded by tears. It was her arm that bolstered me up. It was she who lowered me down onto the bed like a child. She who removed my shoes and pulled back the covers. She who drew the blinds and lifted the quilt to my chin. There, she said, her voice unfamiliar and maternal and laced with a longing that I could not yet place. Get some rest. She slid cold fingers across my forehead. When she lifted them away again, Rosie's silhouette was filling up the doorway. Rosie's the sister. I closed my eyes. I felt Layla rise from the edge of the bed, and I heard her slippered footsteps pad out the door and down the hallway, and I heard the bed springs protest again as Rosie eased herself down beside me. You know what I think? She whispered. I pressed my eyelids more tightly shut. I think you've spent 13 years blaming yourself for something that isn't your fault. Her words crashed toward me as if a dam had been broken. I think you've isolated yourself on purpose as some kind of penance because I think it's easier for you to do that than it is to admit that you can't control everything or to accept the fact that sometimes a person can do everything right and her life will still fall apart. I turned my face toward the wall so she couldn't read anything in it. I wished that I could slow the rush of blood to my cheeks. Anything else, Dr. Gray? I said. I could hear the swish of her hair as she shook her head. Just this, Sylvie. Even if you did fuck something up, and I'm not saying that you did, it doesn't make you a monster. It just makes you, I don't know, the rustle of an exasperated shrug. It makes you human. My fingers warmed beneath the sudden, unexpected pressure of her hand on mine. Then she stood, and the mattress bounced back into place, and she was gone. After she left me, I lay awake in that unfamiliar bedroom and remembered a night I'd lain awake in a camping tent between Jack and Faye, listening to the snap of twigs in the dark as the stars slowly rotated across our mesh skylight. I'd felt a terrifying surge of love for them, a visceral urge to defend them from the dangers beyond our nylon walls. What I couldn't see back then, of course, were the dangers that we carry with us, all the secrets and the dreams that have planted gnarled, stubborn roots inside our hearts. And then I think the last section I'd like to read, one more love section, again, kind of many different kinds of love here, is I should read two more. They're short, I promise, and then we'll kind of wrap up and if anyone has any questions. So this paragraph is Sylvia's kind of a representation of Sylvia's love for her child. She doesn't have Faye with her now. She doesn't know where Faye is, and she lives so much in her memories of Faye, and she's always kind of going back there. And she keeps trying to ask herself this question of what did she do wrong? What should she have done differently? And kind of through it all, she's also coming to the realization that no matter what, this love for her daughter will never change and will always be stable and true. So here's just one of those memories. A memory returns to me, unprompted and vivid. Faye perched on the edge of the kitchen counter, swinging her legs against the cabinets, her dark hair tied back and her cheeks flushed with the warmth radiating from the oven. I'm remembering how she crushed the graham crackers into Jack's birthday cake batter with determined fingers. I'm remembering the jingle of mixing bowls, the hum of the electric mixer, the shine of egg whites whipped to foam. Are you happy that you had your daughter? I can still hear her lilting voice as she sang along with Jack's rock and roll station, and I can taste even now the sour sting of cream cheese frosting on my tongue. There are some moments that never leave us. Some memories that we will carry to the grave. So that's one of her memories of Faye, and that will keep coming back. And then the final sort of element of love here that's really huge is Sylvia's love for her husband, ex-husband when the story begins, Jack, because when they went through this tragedy, their marriage didn't make it. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was writing was the sort of tremendous power of grief and the way in which we all grieve differently. I have some friends who went through something really difficult with a child, and the way they grieved was she sort of went out into the world and joined groups and talked to people and really wanted to be out and active, and he just sort of went inward. And I thought, well, what happens to a marriage then, right? Like, what happens to a relationship if the person you need most needs things that you can't give them, and vice versa? So that's sort of what's happening with Sylvia and Jack here, but the love that they remember is still very present. So this is just one final passage about that. And again, it's a memory. That's when it came to me. The memory of the ramshackle church nudging up against the train tracks, its pews and boxes and its stained glass rippled with age. When I had stepped through the open doors, the sun blazing behind me, my veil like a white flame, Jack's gaze fixed gravely, unblinkingly on mine, everybody in the building had gasped in unison. He was supposed to stand still and wait at the altar for me to reach him, but instead we went sailing toward each other across the ancient floorboards, blown together by an inner wind that cycloned through us both. He met me halfway down the aisle, and I snatched his hand before he could change his mind. Those final steps we took together, our faces glistening in the late spring heat, our heels ringing through the wood, even now knowing what I do, I wouldn't give them back for anything. As I lay among the beveled shadows of that unfamiliar house, I heard different footsteps ringing from a place I couldn't reach. I wriggled out from underneath the quilt and padded barefoot to the window. On the other side of the glass, the slope down to the water was cloaked in fog, obscuring the tangle of grasses, the narrow stone beach, the ebb and flow of waves. In the distance, twinkling in and out of sight, the glimmer of a ship. I couldn't say exactly what it was I was waiting for as I watched the mist billow over black water, like a ghost in the dark. A sign, I guess, a messenger. A silhouette on the shoreline, a phantom island on the move. Sanity is a matter of borders. Inside versus outside, truth versus dream, fact versus fiction. How can a person tell, at any given hour, on any given sleepless night, what side of the line she is on? So, yeah, that's a little bit about the love. And I think kind of the last thing I'll say about the novel, and then if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, is that I think probably I would say the major love that runs through every single character in the story is this deep love of stories and this recognition that stories have the power to move hearts and shape lives, and that they're beautiful and dangerous, and we can love them and fear them at the same time. And yeah, I know that you're all here in the library because you love stories too. So I just wanted to say, yeah, thank you for spending this hour with me and talking with me a little bit about monsters and love and fear and desire, and helping me think about the ways that fiction both sort of helps us escape the world for a while, but then helps us understand it better when we get back. That's all I've got. Thank you. And it's okay if there aren't questions, but happy to take them if there are. Oh, great, too. Yeah.
Can you kind of talk about how you found, so you mentioned there's multiple perspectives, how you found like each unique individual voice for each perspective?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Originally, they were all in first person. So Sylvia was an I, Jack was I, Elizabeth was I, and just felt like too much, and I wasn't able to. One of the things you want to do with perspective is try to make the voices sound as different as possible from each other, and they sounded too similar. And so Sylvia has this kind of like dreamy, poetic, sort of always going back in her mind, ruminating, returning, and so her sentences are kind of long and fluid. Jack is he's a doctor. He's an eye doctor. He sees things clearly. So his sentences are kind of shorter, more direct, a different kind of relationship with his daughter and this monster than the mother has. And then I tried to make Elizabeth, who's a young woman, her voice sound a little younger, a little less complicated. But it definitely takes time. And I think one of the things I try to do when crafting a voice is think about, first of all, okay, so voice is all about point of view, where you're standing when you look at the story, and how does this person, if she's gazing out at this room, how does she see something differently than someone else who's looking at the same picture? And so Sylvia can, look out at the woods and see a monster, and Jack can look out and just see woods. And so that kind of comes in their images. And someone told me once too, for sort of writing fiction, thinking about, I like poetic language, sometimes maybe a little too much. I like metaphors, and thinking about the kind of metaphors and language your characters use is really important. The example given to me was, if you've got this man who lives in the middle of Nebraska and has never been to the coast and never seen water, he probably wouldn't look at the swaying corn and think about ships on the sea or something, right? It wouldn't occur to him. And so thinking about where your characters are coming from is really helpful too. Thanks. Yeah, question.
I actually, minus the whole, which I think is really cool, but minus the whole actual monster thing, I feel like I write a lot of the same type of literature, with family relationships being central and very important. And there will be times where the parents just disappeared, so it's the siblings that have to pick up the pieces. And so I think that's really cool. And I also, I want to know what the ending was.
Of the novel? Oh, I don't want to give it away. Someone might read it. Yeah, shut your ears. I won't say what the ending is. First of all, I love that you're writing these kind of family dramas as well. I mean, every family is so dramatic, right? There's always something. And so that's really cool. And I love sibling stories. I don't understand them, so I'm always looking for them. And in terms of the ending, so the ending it has now, the final 90 pages, was not the original ending. The draft of my manuscript was due to my editor in a week, and I reread it, and I just realized a punch to the gut. I was like, this is all wrong. It just doesn't even make any sense. Who wrote this? It's terrible. And so I wrote to her, my editor, and I was like, I know this is due in a week, but I need a month and I'm going to totally rewrite it. Okay, bye. And then just signed off. So ask for pardon, not permission. And she was great. And I realized, one of the things that's happening in the novel is sort of Sylvia's tracking the movements of this monster, and we know that the monster lives along the shores of Lake Superior in the North Woods, and so Sylvia starts in North Carolina, she moves to Minneapolis and Minnesota, and then she needs to get in Act 3, the kind of final third, up into the woods. And she, in the original version, she didn't. I had her driving there, and then something happened and she turned the car around, so totally lost momentum. But to write that section, all I'll say about it is it takes place in the North Woods, and maybe there's a monster and some other things. But my dog, Cedar, my red heeler, and I were just chatting with Colin earlier about how great red heelers and blue heelers are. She and I got in the car and rented, an Airbnb in sort of 2 harbors along the lake for a couple days, and just hiked around and looked at the water and looked at the pie shops and just really tried to get a sense of the space so I could write it well in the final act. So everything you read in sort of that North Shore part was pretty new, hot off the press. So all I'll say about endings, it's really hard to get them right. And probably one of the things about writing too, now I'm just talking, is that I tell my students too, the thing about writing is the piece of writing, once you're done with it, it's here, it can't change, and we're always changing, right? And we're always growing, and we would always do it differently. I'm a different person than I was a year ago when this got bound, and so I would change it. And so that's kind of one of the challenging things about being a writer too, is knowing that as we grow, the stories stay as they always were, and that distance can expand. So, yeah.
Question, but just a comment. But you mentioned kind of incorporating some real historical events and then bending them to your story. And I think that's really cool.
Oh, thank you. It was really fun. Yeah. I will say I really like those sections. That's why I read them when I'm talking about the novel. But there was one reviewer in the Star Tribune. I won't mention his name, but he was like, "These sections are so boring. They're the worst part of the novel." So no accounting for taste, I guess. But I think that's really fun, and I think that's something people often don't think about when we think about fiction writing is how much research goes into it and how much of the world we draw from. When I was writing scenes about the North Woods, I have this really beautiful book of photographs from the North Shore of Lake Superior, and I was reading about the history of some of the islands, and there were these amazing details like before people came and ravaged the ground for copper mines, golden moss grew 3 feet deep. So if you walked on it, it would just be so spongy. And there were so many caterpillars in the trees that if you stopped, you could hear them crunching. So like just those details, I could never come up with them, right? They're already in the world. You just have to find them. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I agree that your attention to detail is amazing, and even just being an amateur writer, for just a short story, I'll spend 4 or 5 hours in one day researching.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And, you know, they say that that's sort of both the joy and the frustration is you spend so many hours researching to get like the one detail. You know, it's really just going to be like 3 words, but it took so long to get there. Yeah. Yeah.
Question. So the first one, could you just kind of talk about how you went from like initial idea like to first draft to second draft? And also just kind of a fun question. If you could pick like theme song for your book, what do you think that would be?
That is a fantastic question. They're both great. So this novel went through like, I don't know, 4 or 5 kind of major drafts. And actually the very first draft was written from the perspective of a character named Amelia, who in this version, she's this 4-year-old toddler who doesn't really talk. And in my first draft, it was her story, and she was looking for her mother. And I wrote this whole draft. It was her search for her mother who was missing. My agent and I sent it out to editors. Everyone rejected it. It came back, and I was like, okay, I don't want to give up on this story, but maybe this isn't the right perspective. And then I remembered that I think sometimes as you write, you can get a little farther than you mean to from the seed. I was like, my first question was, what would it be like to be a parent, you know? So that's the perspective I should be thinking about. And I thought, okay, so in both versions, you have this kind of missing person, Faye, in the middle of it. And she's here. And if you have her daughter searching for her, there's a mystery, like you want to know what happens. But if you have the mother searching for her, there's still a mystery, but you also have all of these layers of guilt and responsibility and love. And it's just like so much more complex. And so that switch, I think, really helped the novel as well. Yeah, and you know, as I mentioned, inspired by this true crime of the Slender Man stabbing, but it's not about that, right? It's sort of, and so thinking about part of the drafting process was like, okay, these are the questions that are haunting me from that crime. How do I work with those questions while telling my own story? And so that was part of the challenge as well. I mean, one of the things in the true story, one of the girls who did the stabbing, like there were 19 stab wounds. It was pretty intense. And one of the things my editor said was, if we want people to, you know, this is about this young girl who the mother really loves, and she's kind of central. Maybe just like not as gruesome a crime, and just sort of like dial it back a little bit. So thinking about audience in that way was really important. As for songs, someone asked me for, there's a person, I think he's called his podcast is called Large Hearted Boy, and he does sort of these soundtracks. He asks novelists and writers to sort of create a playlist. And so I thought about this, so I have an answer for the question. And I'm a little bit proud but also embarrassed to say that the final song on my playlist was Celine Dion, It's All Coming Back to Me Now, as I sort of think about the relationship between Sylvia and Jack and this love. Another song, there were some songs about place, about Carolina. I think The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was on there, the Gordon Lightfoot song, because the mystery of the Great Lakes plays such a big part. But a band I really like, and really the only band I listen to, is The National, who has like really poetic, sad music. They're called like the Sad Dads. And so that sort of really moody, emo poetry, that feels like the right tone. So if there's ever a movie, I'll let them do the soundtrack. They can. Yeah.
Grimm Brothers story that you were going to tell in the middle of your
Okay, I'll end on a really dark Grimm Brothers story. So I don't know how much you all know about the Grimm Brothers. Something I learned during my research too was the Grimm Brothers, the fairy tales we have now, were really sanitized, really cleaned up. So the brothers had like really dark stories, and then they were writing for this kind of bourgeois audience, and so they had to make some changes to them. And one of the changes they made was, in a lot of the original stories, it was actually the mother who was treating the children badly, like sending them into the woods and doing all these things and being jealous of her daughter. But mothers at that moment were kind of becoming a little bit more of a saintly, revered figure, and people were like, well, a mother wouldn't do that, like a stepmother, that's the person, right? So get a little far removed. So that was one thing that was interesting, but they have this one story. It's really short, and I'm sorry because it's gruesome, but I'm going to tell it anyway, and it's called How Some Children Played at Slaughtering. And it goes like this. There once were two boys, and their father lived on a farm. They lived on a farm with their father. And one day, they saw their father butcher a pig. And so the one boy said to the other boy, let's play at slaughtering. I'll be the farmer, and you be the pig. And he took a knife, and he slit his brother's throat. And he died. The brother died. And that's the whole story. There's no moral. There's no anything. It's just 4 sentences of super gruesomeness. And I sort of think about this a lot, and I keep coming back to it because it's sort of one of the questions of the novel, which is, you can totally play at butchering a pig, but where is the line? Like, when do we cross from play to actually doing the thing? And how do we know? How do we show kids where that line is? How do we know where that line is? And especially in our age of virtual online things, and there's a lot that, we can watch videos of things that never actually happened and hear voices saying words that never actually said them. Like, how do we engage with our world when it's so hard to know what to trust? So yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Brother's story, the actual one, because I'd heard that the actual ones were a lot more gruesome. So, well, first of all, I read a Sleeping Beauty one, which was way worse, but the one I'm talking about that I read it online. It was about a page long. It was like this girl, and the family was starving, and the stepmother kept going out to get more and more bread. And then I think, if I remember correctly, what happened was she eventually butchered one of the children to feed to the other one, but then the other one died of starvation anyway. And I was like,
There's a lot of cannibalism in those stories too. And the end, end scene. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think one of the questions parents have always had is like, how much of those sort of dark stories of the darkness of the world do you introduce to your children? At what age, right? Like, how much do you protect them from, and how much do you show them and warn them of? And the Grimm brothers always said, the title of their collection was Kinder und Hausmärchen. I don't speak German, and they said, so these were called tales for children, or children's tales, but what they meant was, the brothers said, they meant that the tales were supposed to be cared for like children. They weren't for children. And somehow the translation got a little confused. So that's interesting too. How do we take care of stories, even the dark ones? But yeah. Well, thank you all. On that happy note, we'll go out into a beautiful fall afternoon. Thanks so much for being here.